Can salt really be used as a spiritual weapon? Could this common element, present on our tables, possess a hidden power that repels evil spirits and protects us from invisible forces? And what about its use for healing physical and spiritual wounds? The Bible mentions salt several times, but do we fully understand its significance? It's intriguing to consider how such a humble ingredient can be connected to deep spiritual truths. Let's explore what salt reveals about God and our faith. Could salt, so highly valued in ancient cultures, have a divine purpose that transcends time? How has the use of salt in history influenced not only economies but also religious practices? These are fascinating questions that require careful reflection. As we dive into this exploration, we discover that salt, seemingly simple, can be a key to understanding life-changing spiritual truths. This is not just a historical study, it's a spiritual journey. Salt has been used in a myriad of practices across different cultures and religions. From sprinkling salt in the corners of a room for protection to using it in sacred rituals, salt appears to carry a significance that goes beyond its physical properties. Consider the tradition of throwing salt over the shoulder to ward off bad luck. How did this practice originate, and does it have any grounding in biblical teachings? Does the Bible support the use of salt in such superstitious ways, or does it call us to seek protection and purity elsewhere? In many Christian traditions, salt is used in baptismal rites, symbolizing purification and protection against evil. But how do these practices align with the deeper spiritual truths that the Bible reveals? Is the physical act of using salt in ceremonies merely symbolic, or does it hold a deeper, perhaps divine power that we have yet to fully comprehend? The use of salt in religious rituals, whether in Christianity or other faiths, raises questions about the true nature of spiritual protection and the role of physical elements in our faith. Consider also the widespread use of salt in folk medicine, such as gargling salt water to heal a sore throat or applying salt compresses to reduce inflammation. These practices are believed to draw out infection and bring about healing. But what does the Bible say about the power of physical substances like salt in the healing process? Should we rely on such remedies, or is there a deeper, spiritual approach to healing that we are called to pursue? Salt is also used in Jewish rituals, such as koshering meat and purifying spaces before entering a shrine. These practices demonstrate a deep respect for the symbolic purity that salt represents. But as Christians, how should we view these ancient traditions? Are they mere cultural remnants, or do they reveal a spiritual truth that we, too, should embrace? What does the Bible truly teach us about the use of salt in our worship and daily life? Salt has a long history as a symbol of loyalty and covenant, often used in wedding ceremonies to represent the unbreakable bond between a couple. This raises an intriguing question. Does the Bible endorse the use of salt in this way, or is there a deeper, more spiritual understanding of covenant and loyalty that we should be pursuing? How does the use of salt in these ceremonies compare to the covenants God establishes with His people? How can we apply these teachings to our daily lives? Could understanding the true power of salt transform our approach to faith? These questions are not merely academic, they are deeply personal. They invite us to consider how God might use common elements to reveal profound truths. From here, we embark on an investigation that promises not only to enlighten but also to challenge and strengthen our spiritual walk. Salt in the Bible is more than a symbol. It's an invitation to explore the fidelity, purity, and protection that God offers. Are we prepared to fully understand what this means for us today? Is it possible that salt is a powerful spiritual tool that God has given us to live a life of holiness and faithfulness? Let's walk together on this road of discovery, where each grain of salt can illuminate a new facet of our faith. Salt played a vital role in the economy and culture of many ancient civilizations. In fact, at certain times, salt was as valuable as gold. The Romans, for example, paid their soldiers with salt, a practice that gave rise to the word salary. But why was salt so precious? Because, in addition to preserving food, it symbolized purity and incorruptibility, characteristics that ancient cultures associated with the divine. How did this shape their spiritual practices? In ancient China, salt was a symbol of immortality and an essential part of religious rituals. The Chinese believed that salt could purify and protect against evil. This understanding was not unique to China. In Egypt, salt was used in the mummification process, preserving the body for the afterlife. These practices reveal a universal perception of salt as a substance with powers beyond the physical. But what is the true spiritual essence of salt? Greece and Mesopotamia also considered salt a sacred element. In Greece, salt was offered to the gods as part of sacrifices. It was believed to purify offerings, making them acceptable. In Mesopotamia, salt symbolized a pact between friends, an unbreakable bond that reflected the covenant of fidelity and loyalty. These examples show that, in various cultures, salt was much more than a condiment. It was a bridge between the material and the spiritual. Ancient cultures used salt not only for its physical properties but because they saw in it a reflection of the eternal. The value attributed to salt reflects humanity's quest for the transcendent, for connection with something greater that transcends time and matter. Could understanding these ancient practices help us rediscover the role of salt in our own spirituality? How can these ancient values enrich our current understanding of salt? This deep connection between salt and spirituality is not merely historical. Today, when we study the role of salt in the Bible, we begin to see that God used a common element to teach extraordinary lessons about covenant, purity, and protection. How did these ancient economic and cultural practices shape the biblical view of salt? And how can we apply these lessons in our modern spiritual life? The exploration continues. What can we learn by bringing these ancient truths into the present? Are we ready to rediscover salt as a symbol of our own spiritual journey? Reflecting on the role of salt in history challenges us to consider how God can use even the simplest things to reveal eternal truths. And you, how do you see salt now? The Bible mentions salt in various contexts, both in the Old and New Testaments, indicating that it has deep spiritual significance. In the Old Testament, salt appears in offerings, covenants, and purification rituals. But why did God choose salt for these purposes? Is salt merely a symbolic element, or is there something deeper to explore? These questions lead us to consider the role of salt as a representation of divine covenant and faithfulness. In Leviticus, God commands that salt be added to all grain offerings, symbolizing the purity and preservation of the covenant. In Numbers, the term covenant of salt is used to describe a perpetual pact, indicating that salt not only preserves but symbolizes the durability and faithfulness. These references suggest that salt has a spiritual significance that goes beyond its physical function. It represents the purity, incorruptibility, and unchangeable nature of God's covenant with His people. In the New Testament, Jesus uses the metaphor of salt to describe His followers. You are the salt of the earth, Matthew 5 verse 13. Here, salt symbolizes the preserving and purifying influence that Christians should have in the world. But what does it mean to be the salt of the earth? Jesus was calling us to live lives that reflect the purity and faithfulness of God, lives that preserve and protect against moral and spiritual decay. This metaphor challenges each of us to consider how we can be agents of preservation and purity in our society. Moreover, Paul, in Colossians 4 verse 6, exhorts us that our words should be seasoned with salt. This implies that our words should be wise, pure, and edifying, bringing preservation and life wherever they are spoken. Salt, in this context, is a symbol of divine wisdom that guides our daily interactions. How can we apply this in our lives? Do our words and actions reflect this purity and wisdom? What do we need to change to be truly seasoned with salt? The biblical references to salt invite us to deep reflection on the significance of this element in our spiritual lives. Salt in the Bible is not just a symbol. It's a call to purity, faithfulness, and preservation. Are we living up to that call? As we consider the role of salt in the Bible, we are challenged to reflect on our own lives and ask ourselves, how can we be salt of the earth in a world that so desperately needs purity and faithfulness? Salt in the Bible offers us a rich tapestry of spiritual meaning, a tool to better understand our relationship with God and our role in the world. How can we apply these teachings to our daily lives? And what more can we discover by exploring the symbolism of salt? This is an invitation to deepen our faith and live in a way that reflects the character of God. Let's continue this journey of discovery. In Judaism, salt has always held deep significance, especially regarding the covenant of salt, mentioned in Numbers 18:19. This covenant symbolizes a perpetual pact, an unbreakable promise of faithfulness and purity between God and His people. But why salt? What makes this element so significant that God would choose it to symbolize an eternal covenant? As we investigate, we see that salt, with its ability to preserve, is a perfect symbol of God's unchangeable and eternal nature. Salt was used in the Old Testament as an integral part of offerings and sacrifices. In Leviticus, God commands that all offerings be accompanied by salt, an act that symbolizes the purification and incorruptibility necessary for an offering to be acceptable before God. But beyond its practical function, salt represents the purity and holiness that God demands of His people. What does this mean for us today? How can we apply these principles in our own life of faith? In modern times, salt continues to play a significant role in various Jewish traditions. For example, salt is used on the Sabbath to season the challah bread, symbolizing the preservation and purification of the sanctity of the day of rest. Additionally, salt is often used in wedding ceremonies, representing the unbreakable covenant between the couple and God. These contemporary practices reveal the ongoing importance of salt in Jewish spiritual life, from biblical times to today. Jewish tradition also holds that salt has the power to ward off evil and purify environments, a practice that dates back to ancient times. This belief reflects the view of salt as an element that not only preserves but also protects. By using salt in purification rituals, Jews maintain a connection between the physical and the spiritual, between the temporal and the eternal. But do these practices have relevance for us, Christians? What can we learn from this rich and ancient tradition? Salt, in Judaism, is more than just a condiment. It's a profound symbol of faithfulness, purity, and protection. As we study these traditions, we are led to consider how salt can enrich our own spiritual life. As Christians, we are called to be the salt of the earth, to preserve and protect holiness in our lives and in our communities. What can we learn from Jewish traditions to live in a way that honors this calling? As we explore Jewish traditions involving salt, we begin to see how this element plays a vital role in spirituality, both in the past and present. Are we ready to integrate this understanding into our own spiritual practice? And how can we apply these lessons to strengthen our relationship with God and others? This reflection invites us to a new understanding of salt and its role in our faith. Salt, with its profound significance in Judaism, challenges us to consider how seemingly simple elements can have deep spiritual meanings. How can we, then, use salt to symbolize our own faithfulness to God? And what does this teach us about the importance of purity and holiness in our lives? The exploration continues, and the lessons we learn can transform our spiritual practice. Salt, as a symbol of covenant and faithfulness, has a central role in the Bible. The covenant of salt, mentioned in Numbers 18:19, is not just a metaphor but an expression of an unbreakable relationship between God and His people. What makes salt such a powerful symbol? Perhaps it is its ability to preserve, a quality that reflects the unchanging nature of divine faithfulness. But how does this image of preservation apply to us today? In ancient cultures, salt was often used to seal pacts and covenants. In the biblical context, salt symbolizes the durability and incorruptibility of God's covenant with Israel. This use of salt invites us to reflect on the depth and permanence of God's faithfulness. But it also challenges us to consider our own faithfulness. Are we living up to the standard that God sets through this powerful symbol? Jesus, in the New Testament, calls His disciples the salt of the earth. This declaration is more than a poetic metaphor. It is a call to live lives that reflect the faithfulness and purity that salt symbolizes. But what does this mean in practice? Being the salt of the earth implies being a preserving and purifying presence in a world that often strays from God's principles. How can we, then, live in a way that honors this call and preserves holiness in our society? The covenant of salt also teaches us about the importance of constancy in our relationships. Salt, with its ability to maintain its integrity even under adverse conditions, challenges us to be faithful and consistent in our commitments to God and others. This means upholding our values and principles, even when we face pressures to compromise our faith. How can we apply this lesson of constancy and faithfulness in our daily lives? The symbolism of salt as covenant and faithfulness also calls us to reflect on the integrity of our faith. Are we living in a way that reflects the durability and purity of the covenant we have with God? And how can we strengthen our faithfulness in a world that often pushes us away from our spiritual commitments? These are questions that each of us must seriously consider in our walk with God. The study of salt as a symbol of covenant and faithfulness challenges us to reflect on the depth of our spiritual commitment. Are we living up to the high standard that salt represents? And how can we apply these principles to renew our covenant with God and others? This is an invitation to rediscover the importance of faithfulness in our faith and relationships. As we continue to explore the meaning of salt in the Bible, we are challenged to consider how this element can transform our understanding of covenant and faithfulness. What does it mean, after all, to be a person of covenant of salt? And how can we live up to this call in our daily lives? The answers might change the way we understand our faith. Salt has been used throughout history in purification rituals, both in Judaism and other religions. In the Old Testament, salt was an integral part of sacrifices and offerings, symbolizing the purity necessary to approach God. But why was salt chosen for this role? Perhaps it is its ability to preserve and purify that makes it such a powerful symbol of holiness. What can we learn from this for our spiritual life? In Judaism, salt is used to purify food and objects, reflecting the belief that it can remove impurities. This practice is not merely ritualistic. It reflects a deep understanding of the purity necessary in spiritual life. But how can we apply this concept of purification to our own lives? Are we purifying ourselves adequately to approach God? Salt challenges us to consider our own need for holiness. The use of salt in other religions is also significant. In Hinduism, salt is used in rituals of bodily and spiritual purification, symbolizing the removal of impurities and protection against negative forces. These practices indicate that salt is seen as a universal purification agent, a substance that transcends cultural and religious barriers. But what does this tell us about the nature of salt? How can we better understand its role in our own quest for holiness? The idea of holiness is closely linked to the use of salt. In the Bible, salt represents the purity and incorruptibility that God demands of His people. But what does this mean for us, who are called to be the salt of the earth? Salt invites us to reflect on our own spiritual purity and the need to remain incorruptible in a world that often tempts us to compromise our faith. How can we live in a way that reflects this purity and holiness? Salt, in its role as a purifier, also reminds us of the importance of removing impurities from our lives to draw closer to God. This can mean turning away from practices, thoughts, and attitudes that distance us from our relationship with the divine. What do we need to purify in our lives to become holier? How can we use the symbolism of salt to guide our quest for a holier life? The study of salt in purification and holiness leads us to a deep reflection on our own spiritual practices. Are we purifying ourselves adequately to approach God? And how can we use salt, symbolically, to help us achieve the purity necessary for a life of holiness? These are questions that we all must consider as we seek to live according to the high standard that God has set. As we explore the use of salt in purification, we are challenged to reflect on our own spiritual journey. Are we doing enough to purify our lives? And how can we apply the biblical understanding of salt to help us live a holier life? This is a call to deepen our quest for holiness and purity, using salt as a guide in our spiritual walk. Salt is widely known for its preserving properties, but its role as a spiritual protector is equally fascinating. In many cultures, salt is used to repel evil spirits and protect against negative forces. But where does this belief come from? Could salt possess a spiritual power that we still don't fully understand? As we investigate this question, we discover that salt, in addition to physically preserving, may also play a significant spiritual role. In the Old Testament, salt is used in contexts of preservation and protection, such as in offerings and sacrifices that symbolize the perpetual covenant between God and His people. But how does this idea of physical preservation translate into spiritual protection? Could salt really protect us from spiritual threats? These are questions that lead us to explore more deeply the role of salt in protecting against both physical and spiritual corruption. Many popular traditions use salt as a barrier against evil, sprinkling it around homes or doors to ward off evil spirits. While this practice may seem superstitious, it points to a universal understanding of salt as a protective agent. But what does the Bible teach us about using salt for spiritual protection? Are we underestimating the spiritual power of salt? How can we discern between superstitious practices and the true spiritual significance of salt? Salt, in its role as a preserver, also raises questions about its effectiveness in spiritual protection. If salt can preserve food and bodies from deterioration, could it also preserve our souls from spiritual corruption? How can we use this understanding in religious practice and the pursuit of spiritual protection? What does this mean for our life of faith? Are we protecting our souls from corruption as we should? The use of salt as a protective agent challenges us to reconsider the power of this element in our spiritual life. Are we underestimating the spiritual value of salt? And how can we use this knowledge to protect our faith and our spiritual life against the forces that try to corrupt it? These are vital questions that we must all consider as we seek to live according to the principles that God has revealed to us. As we explore the role of salt as a preserver and protector, we are challenged to reflect on how we can apply these concepts in our lives. How can we protect our faith against spiritual corruption? And how can salt be a symbol of this protection in our journey of faith? These are profound questions that invite us to a new understanding of the spiritual power of salt. Salt, with its role as a preserver and spiritual protector, offers us a rich metaphor for considering the importance of protecting our spiritual life against the forces of evil. How can we apply this symbolism in our daily spiritual practice? And what does this teach us about the importance of living a life of holiness and faithfulness? The reflection continues. Today, salt continues to play a significant role in various Christian practices. But how do these practices align with biblical and theological traditions? Does salt still hold the same spiritual significance that it had in the Bible, or have its interpretations changed over time? These questions invite us to reflect on the contemporary use of salt in the Christian faith and consider how it can be a powerful symbol in our spiritual practice. In many Christian denominations, salt is used in rituals of blessing and protection. For example, in some baptismal rites, salt is used to symbolize the purification of the soul and protection against evil. But do these practices reflect a deep understanding of the biblical symbolism of salt? Or are we drifting away from its spiritual roots? These are important questions we must consider as we reflect on the role of salt in our faith. Moreover, salt is often used in popular protective rituals, such as sprinkling salt around homes or using salt in personal blessings. These practices often blend with superstitious beliefs, raising important theological questions. To what extent are these practices acceptable within the Christian faith? Should salt be seen as a sacred symbol or merely as a physical element? How can we discern between legitimate use of salt and practices that may compromise our faith? Contemporary theologians offer various perspectives on the use of salt. Some defend its liturgical use, highlighting its symbolic importance, while others criticize practices they see as superstitious, arguing that true protection and purification come from faith in Christ, not from objects or external rituals. But how can we balance these different perspectives and apply the use of salt in a way that strengthens our faith? St. Augustine offers a critical perspective on the symbolic use of salt, cautioning against the over-reliance on physical symbols at the expense of spiritual truth. Augustine believed that while symbols like salt can point to deeper spiritual realities, they should not become objects of veneration themselves. He warned that Christians must focus on the inward transformation that these symbols represent, rather than the external rituals. Augustine's thoughts challenge believers to examine their hearts, ensuring that their faith is rooted in a genuine relationship with God, rather than in the mere observance of rituals. Charles Spurgeon, a renowned preacher, emphasized the importance of maintaining the purity of the Christian message, likening it to the preserving quality of salt. Spurgeon warned against the dilution of the gospel, stating that just as salt can lose its flavor, so too can the church lose its effectiveness if it compromises on the truth. He argued that Christians must be the salt of the earth by upholding the unadulterated gospel, ensuring that their influence remains pure and strong. N.T. Wright, a contemporary theologian, expands on this idea by connecting the concept of being salt of the earth to the mission of the church in the world. Wright suggests that the church, like salt, is called to preserve the world from moral decay by living out the teachings of Jesus in a transformative way. He emphasizes that the church's role is not just to maintain its own purity, but to engage with the world, bringing the flavor of God's kingdom into all aspects of life, thereby preventing societal decay. The study of contemporary interpretations of salt in Christianity challenges us to reflect on our own use of this element. Are we honoring the biblical symbolism of salt, or are we straying into practices that may compromise our faith? And how can we use salt in a way that strengthens our relationship with God and helps us live according to His teachings? These are questions that invite us to deep reflection on the role of salt in our spiritual life. As we explore these questions, we are called to consider how we can rediscover salt as a powerful symbol of purity, faithfulness, and protection in our faith. How can we apply these teachings to our daily lives? And what more can we discover by reflecting on the symbolism of salt in the contemporary context? This is an invitation to deepen our faith and live in a way that reflects the character of God. The use of salt in contemporary Christian faith offers a rich opportunity to consider how simple elements can have deep spiritual meaning. How can we, then, use salt to symbolize our own faithfulness to God? And what does this teach us about the importance of purity and holiness in our lives? The exploration continues, and the lessons we learn can transform our spiritual practice. Throughout this journey, we have seen that salt is much more than a simple seasoning. It carries deep meanings in various cultures and religions. From its use in ancient economy and culture to its presence in the scriptures, salt symbolizes covenant, purity, and protection. The exploration of these themes reveals how ancient practices and contemporary uses of salt intertwine with spiritual truths that have profound implications for our faith. But how can we apply these understandings in our spiritual life? Salt invites us to reflect on the depth of our faith and the purity of our commitment to God. We've studied the many practices involving salt, from its use in spiritual protection rituals and healing remedies to its symbolic role in religious ceremonies like baptism and wedding covenants. These traditions raise questions about the true nature of salt's power. Are these practices merely cultural, or do they hold spiritual significance that aligns with biblical teachings? The Bible repeatedly uses salt as a metaphor for the covenantal relationship between God and His people, urging us to consider how we live out this covenant in our daily lives. Leviticus 2 verse 13, Numbers 18:19. Moreover, we've explored how theologians like Spurgeon, N.T. Wright, and Augustine have reflected on the deeper spiritual implications of being the salt of the earth, Matthew 5 verse 13. These reflections challenge us to uphold the purity of our faith, engage with the world to prevent moral decay, and focus on inward spiritual transformation rather than external rituals. The Bible consistently emphasizes that true purity and protection come from a relationship with God, not from the physical elements themselves. As Jesus taught, our influence as Christians must be like salt, preserving, purifying, and enriching the world around us. It's crucial to reflect on what God truly expects from us as salt of the earth. The power does not lie in the physical salt or any other element, but in the spiritual truths they symbolize. God calls us to live lives of holiness, faithfulness, and active engagement with the world, reflecting His purity and preserving His truth. Colossians 4 verse 6. The Bible reminds us that our true power comes from the Holy Spirit working within us, not from external rituals or symbols. Acts 1 verse 8. Therefore, let us strive to be the salt that brings flavor to the world, living out our faith with integrity and purpose. God expects us to be His representatives on earth, upholding His standards and sharing His love with others. Our calling as Christians is to be the preservative against moral and spiritual decay in the world, standing firm in our faith and living out the values of the kingdom of God. The real importance of being salt of the earth lies in our commitment to God and our willingness to influence the world for good. As we embrace this role, let us remember that our strength and effectiveness come from God alone, who empowers us to fulfill His purpose in every aspect of our lives. Reflecting on these truths, we are reminded that while physical elements like salt have symbolic significance, they are ultimately pointers to deeper spiritual realities. Let us focus on cultivating a heart that is pure, a faith that is strong, and a life that reflects the transformative power of the gospel. By doing so, we fulfill our true purpose as the salt of the earth, living out the mission that God has entrusted to us with grace and truth. If this message has resonated with you, take action today. Spend time in prayer, study the scriptures, and ask God to reveal how you can be His salt in the world. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, and let's continue this journey together. Don't forget to subscribe for more insights and reflections on living out your faith. Let's be the salt that transforms the world, one life at a time.